Think Rome was all marble statues and fancy togas? Think again. Behind those elegant columns, the Romans invented punishments so twisted, so cruel that even hell would look polite. From being roasted alive in a metal bowl to slowly starved in iron cages, their dark secrets will haunt your nightmares and make you laugh at just how insane humans can be. Ready to see the gruesome truth they never taught you in history class? Chapter 1. Damnatio ad bestias. Death by beasts. The Romans believed that some men deserved to be shredded alive, and for those unlucky souls there was no fate darker than being thrown into the arena for damnatio ad bestias, the punishment of death by beasts, a spectacle crafted not only to kill but to humiliate, to turn a human body into raw meat for animals, while thousands roared in delight. For the condemned were stripped naked, smeared with blood or animal fat to drive the beasts into frenzy, and then chained in the sand where lions, leopards, and bears would be released to devour them. And the horror was not in the suddenness of death, but in the slow tearing apart. The claws that dug into flesh, the jaws that crushed bones, the screams that echoed against stone walls as the beasts feasted, because this was no execution in silence. It was theater. It was ritual. And every bite was a message that Rome's enemies, slaves, and criminals had no dignity worth sparing, no humanity left to defend. Their bodies were property of the empire, destined to be broken for pleasure. Imagine the silence before the cage doors opened, the crowd holding its breath, the condemned man trembling on his knees knowing that the air already stank of blood and death. And then the iron bars screeched apart and a lion charged, its mane blazing in the sunlight, its roar drowning the cries of the victim, the first impact driving him to the ground, claws raking across his chest, ribs snapping like dry wood, the crowd erupting as the man flailed helplessly beneath the weight of the beast, his life draining not in moments but in agonizing fragments, each scream another offering to Rome's hunger for spectacle. The darkest secret of this punishment was that it was not always quick. Sometimes the animals were starved for days, made ravenous so their attack would be more savage. But other times they were half-fed, deliberately restrained so that they would toy with the victim, maul without killing, bite without finishing, drag the man screaming across the arena floor until he was begging for death that would not come. And the Romans loved this torment. For the longer the suffering, the better the show. And if the beasts lost interest, executioners would whip them back into frenzy, forcing the game to continue until every shred of flesh was torn away. Women, too, were condemned to this fate, and the horror multiplied when female victims were stripped in front of leering eyes, their bodies paraded not as humans, but as bait for animals, some tied to stakes so the beasts could circle them slowly before tearing them apart. And children, too, were sometimes thrown in, small bodies broken with the same cold indifference, their screams merging with the roar of the crowd, creating a chorus of agony that Rome called justice. The arena was not a place of fairness, it was a machine of terror, designed to remind every slave and subject that resistance ended in blood, and the punishment of damnatio ad bestias was the empire's darkest tool. A carnival of horror meant to erase not just the life of the condemned, but their very existence. For what greater humiliation than to die as food, to have your final moments defined not by words or courage, but by the tearing of teeth through flesh, your bones scattered across sand, your blood soaking into the earth while Rome cheered. Some victims were dressed in mock costumes before being slaughtered, forced to play out cruel parodies, made to look like mythological villains, tied to stakes like Prometheus, and then torn apart by eagles or dressed as wild men before being torn by wolves, the Romans twisting legend into nightmare, laughing as life and myth blurred in a haze of gore. And the execution was never just death, it was a performance, a warning, a carnival of blood that stained the soul of Rome forever. What made this punishment worse than crucifixion was not only the cruelty of the beasts, but the spectacle itself. For crucifixion killed slowly in silence on a lonely hill, but damnatio ad bestias turned pain into entertainment, forcing the condemned to die as a living plaything, an object stripped of all dignity, surrounded by thousands who saw not a man, but a body to be shredded, a toy for lions. And this horror was not rare but regular, woven into the fabric of Roman life, celebrated as part of festivals, holy days, and political games, proving that Rome's greatness was built not only on conquest, but on cruelty, not only on law, but on blood. The amphitheater smelled of iron and rot, its sand stained by countless deaths, And yet Romans filled the seats again and again, craving the sight of a man torn alive, addicted to suffering. Their culture addicted to watching pain unfold in front of their eyes, and that addiction was Rome's true secret, darker than any history book dares to admit. For what civilization calls itself enlightened when it treats humans as bait? When it feeds people to beasts, not because of necessity, but because of pleasure, because of spectacle, because of cruelty disguised as justice. Damnatio ad bestias was not just punishment, it was Rome revealing its soul, and that soul was carved in blood and screams. A nightmare dressed as entertainment, and no empire that delighted in such horror can ever claim to be truly civilized. Chapter 2. Poena Culi, the Sack of Death. The Romans believed that some crimes were so monstrous they required punishments that erased the criminal, not only from life, but from the memory of humanity. And for parricide, the killing of one's own parent, the empire had crafted one of the most grotesque and haunting rituals of death ever conceived, known as Poena Culi, the Sack of Death, a punishment so cruel that even whispering its name sent a shiver through Roman households. For it was not enough to kill the guilty. Rome demanded humiliation, horror, and obliteration, so the condemned was sewn alive into a leather sack. But not alone, for inside the suffocating darkness, they were joined by a viper, a dog, a rooster, and a monkey, creatures that symbolized chaos, rage, betrayal, and madness, so that the parricide would not only drown in terror, but die surrounded by claws, fangs, and the frenzy of animals trapped in the same tomb. Imagine the moment the sack was prepared. The crowd gathered to watch, the criminal stripped of dignity, bound and beaten, their mouth gagged to silence their cries, then forced into the bag where the animals were already thrashing in panic, the snake coiling, the dog snarling, the rooster pecking, the monkey screeching in terror, and as the leather was sewn shut, the air grew heavy, the space tighter, the victim pressed against fur, scales, feathers, teeth, a living nightmare of thrashing bodies, every bite and scratch a prelude to suffocation. And then, when the sack was sealed, it was dragged to the river and hurled into the water, the condemned kicking wildly inside as the sack filled with water, the animals biting in frenzy as they drowned together in darkness, their struggles muffled by leather, their bodies sinking into silence. The horror was not only in the method, but in the meaning, for Rome believed that killing a parent was such a violation of natural order that the murderer did not deserve a normal death or even a proper grave. Their body was to be erased, denied burial, cursed to float in water like refuse, devoured by fish, forgotten by soil. And this secrecy was the true cruelty, because Romans believed the soul could not find peace without burial. So the parricide's spirit was doomed to wander in eternal torment, never to rest, always lost. And in this way, the punishment went beyond flesh. It reached into the afterlife itself. The darkest secret of Poena Culi was that the animals were not symbols alone. They were chosen for their violence, for the pain they inflicted in the last frantic minutes, for the dog's snapping jaws, the rooster's sharp beak, the snake's venom, the monkey's claws and madness, creating a chaos of pain inside the sack, a hell created in leather, a small world of screams and scratches in which the condemned was torn by nature itself before drowning. And all of it done not behind closed doors but in public, because this punishment was meant to terrify, to remind every Roman child that parents were sacred, untouchable, and that betraying them meant becoming less than human, thrown to the river like garbage. The ritual was precise, the leather sack carefully sewn, the animals chosen with care, the river selected to carry away the cursed body, and sometimes, if the sack washed ashore, locals would burn it to keep the corruption from spreading, as if the very body of the parricide carried disease, a pollution Rome would not allow to touch its soil, a nightmare so profound that even death could not end the stigma. The screams inside the sack were said to echo like muffled thunder, a sound that haunted those who listened, for it was not the cry of a man alone, but the clash of animals and human, a chaos of suffering that turned the punishment into something more than execution. It was ritualized horror, a ceremony of erasure, and Rome carried it out with pride, believing cruelty itself was justice. Compared to crucifixion, Poena Culi was not about long suffering under the sun, but about enclosing horror in darkness, crushing a man's humanity by binding him with beasts, sewing him shut, drowning him nameless. And what made it worse was the symbolism. the fact that the parricide was denied everything Romans considered sacred: family, dignity, burial, memory, and instead given only the sack, the animals, the river, and eternal shame. Some accounts whispered of sacks bursting open when thrown into water, the animals clawing free, the half-dead criminal writhing in the mud before being clubbed to death by guards. Their bodies burned in haste to erase the pollution, and these stories were told to children as warnings. Ghost tales meant to terrify them into obedience, for the punishment was as much about spectacle as it was about death, as much about fear as it was about justice. The Romans, who prided themselves on order and law, revealed in this punishment the truth of their soul, that beneath marble and philosophy lurked a craving for spectacle, a lust for horror, and poenically was proof that Rome did not just kill, it created nightmares. It crafted punishments that stripped a man not only of life, but of legacy. And in that sack, underwater, gnawed by beasts, erased by ritual, a parricide ceased to exist. Their death remembered only as a warning, their soul condemned forever. Chapter 3. Burning alive, the flames of Rome. The Romans had many ways to destroy a body, but nothing was more terrifying than the punishment of being burned alive. For fire was considered both purifying and damning, a cruel paradox where the condemned was consumed by flames in front of a crowd that saw their body not as flesh, but as fuel. And the darkest truth was that the Romans did not always light the fire to kill swiftly. Instead, they staged the burning as theater, prolonging the agony, letting the victim roast piece by piece, their screams rising like smoke into the sky while the crowd cheered. And unlike crucifixion, which left the body intact to rot on the cross, fire erased everything, leaving nothing behind but ash. And that was Rome's true intention, to not only kill but to erase, to strip a man of identity, flesh, and memory in the most violent way possible. Victims were tied to wooden stakes in the middle of the arena, drenched with pitch or oil to ignite more easily, their bodies shaking with terror as the executioner brought the torch close. And when the flames licked at their legs, the true horror began. For fire does not kill instantly. It crawls slowly, blistering the skin, peeling flesh away in layers, filling the air with the sickening stench of burning meat. And the victims' screams pierced through the roaring flames, their body thrashing against ropes that only dug deeper as they struggled, until their voice cracked, their lungs filled with smoke, and their eyes melted in their sockets, all of it unfolding under the watchful eyes of thousands who had come not for justice but for spectacle, turning death into entertainment. Sometimes the punishment was even darker, for Rome enjoyed combining fire with mockery, forcing victims to wear wax masks that melted grotesquely as the fire rose, making their faces drip into formless horror before the crowd, or burning criminals in pairs, binding two people back to back so that they roasted together, each feeling the other's body shake in agony, a twisted union in death. And the cruelty was sharpened further when slaves were punished, for a single slave's crime could condemn hundreds. Entire households burned alive in front of their masters as warning that Rome's order depended on fear, and the crackle of flames became a language of terror across the empire. The darkest secret of burning alive was that sometimes the condemned were not killed outright, but half-burned, left smoldering, their flesh blackened, but their hearts still beating, dragged from the flames only to be thrown back in again. Their suffering prolonged so the crowd could drink in every detail. And this revealed the truth of Roman punishment, that it was never only about ending life, but about extracting as much pain and fear as possible before death, turning the body into a message, a lesson, and a spectacle all at once. The ritual of burning was often tied to religious overtones, for Rome believed fire cleansed corruption, and so the condemned were cast as offerings, their bodies turned into smoke that rose to the gods. But beneath the mask of ritual, there was only cruelty, for the gods did not ask for this horror. Rome did, the crowd did, the system did, and the fire was not sacred but sadistic, an altar of flame where Rome worshipped its own power. The executioners sometimes smeared victims with flammable resins, making their bodies burn brighter and longer, like human torches. And when night fell, these living torches were set along the roads, lighting the darkness with screams, their flames casting shadows on the stones while travelers passed in silence, a vision so haunting that it scarred the memory of those who saw it. For the light was not from firewood, but from human fat, from a body turned into fuel. The difference between burning alive and crucifixion was not just the method, but the totality. For crucifixion left bones, corpses, and relics of death behind, while fire obliterated, reducing a man to dust, erasing all traces, leaving only the memory of screams carried by smoke. And this erasure was what Rome sought, to make the condemned vanish into nothing, denied even the dignity of a corpse, their identity dissolved in flame. Some whispered that the smell of burning human flesh was intoxicating to the crowd, that the people leaned forward to breathe it in, a scent of power, fear, and domination, proof that Rome's authority was absolute, and that those who defied it would not only die but burn in ways so cruel they could not be forgotten, their screams echoing long after the flames died out. Burning alive was not a punishment reserved for ordinary crimes, but for those Rome considered unworthy of existence, traitors, rebels, and dangerous slaves, people whose very memory needed to be destroyed. And so the flames were not just fire, but judgment, consuming both body and soul, branding terror into all who watched. For the Romans believed fear was the strongest chain, and nothing bound people tighter than the sight of flesh melting, bones blackening, and lives screaming away in fire. This punishment, darker than crucifixion, revealed Rome not as a civilization of reason and law, but as a theater of cruelty, a society that painted justice in flame and suffering, a world where human bodies were fuel and agony was entertainment. And in the glow of those fires, the truth of the empire was clear, that Rome was built not only on stone and steel, but on the ash of those it chose to burn alive. Chapter 4. Decimation. Death by betrayal of brothers. The Romans had a punishment so chilling, so twisted, that it did not come from the hands of enemies or beasts, but from the hands of one's own brothers in arms. And this nightmare was called decimation, a military punishment that turned loyalty into bloodshed, a ritual where soldiers killed their own comrades to preserve discipline. And the horror of it was not only the death, but the betrayal. For decimation took the bonds of brotherhood and shattered them in a frenzy of stones, clubs, and despair. And it began when a unit was found guilty of cowardice, desertion, or mutiny, the general ordering that every 10th man would die, not by his sword but by the fists and weapons of his fellow soldiers. So that Rome's legions learned that disobedience would not only bring punishment from commanders, but death from within their own ranks, creating a fear so suffocating that men marched to battle not only terrified of the enemy, but terrified of each other. Imagine the terror as the unit was assembled, the silence heavy, the soldiers trembling as lots were drawn to decide who would die. Every man knowing that fate was random, that bravery or skill meant nothing, that chance could condemn him in a moment. And when the unlucky ones were chosen, there was no honor left, no dignity, only the sickening realization that the men they had fought beside, shared meals with, bled with, would now beat them to death, turning comrades into executioners, friends into murderers. And this was the genius of Roman cruelty, for it was not enough to kill the guilty. Rome demanded that others share in the blood, that every man feel the weight of the crime, that every survivor be stained with murder, bound forever by guilt and fear. The condemned were stripped of armor, sometimes tied or sometimes left standing, trembling in disbelief. And then the killing began, not swift with swords but slow and brutal with stones, clubs, and fists. The soldiers surrounding their chosen brothers, striking them down in a frenzy of violence, bones shattering, blood spraying across the dirt, screams echoing in the camp, a punishment that was more massacre than execution. And the victims often did not die quickly. They begged, they cried out, they collapsed only to be struck again and again until their bodies lay broken and lifeless in the dust. The darkest secret of decimation was that it did not only punish the guilty, but destroyed the innocent. For sometimes entire units were blamed for the failure of a few, and men who had fought bravely were slaughtered simply because they were unlucky in the draw. And in this way, Rome proved that its system cared nothing for justice, but only for fear, because fear was stronger than fairness, and terror bound the legions tighter than loyalty. The survivors of decimation did not walk away clean. They were forced to sleep outside the camp without shelter, to eat only barley instead of wheat, to live with the weight of having killed their own, and the punishment stretched far beyond the moment of death. It became a curse, a shadow that haunted the unit, breaking trust, spreading paranoia, poisoning the very brotherhood that was supposed to hold the legions together. Generals like Crassus used decimation to crush rebellion, ordering whole cohorts to slaughter 1 in 10 of their men, and history whispers of the ground soaked with the blood of soldiers whose only crime was standing in the wrong line, their deaths becoming warnings carved into the memory of every legion, teaching men that Rome's wrath was more frightening than any enemy spear. What made decimation worse than crucifixion was not only the brutality, but the intimacy, for crucifixion was carried out by strangers, executioners who had no bond with their victims, but decimation forced men to look into the eyes of their comrades, to hear their cries, to feel their blood on their hands, to murder the very brothers who once saved their lives. And this betrayal cut deeper than any nail, leaving wounds that never healed, scars that festered in the silence of campfires, turning men into hollow shells of obedience. Some accounts tell of soldiers refusing to strike their friends, only to be killed themselves, while others describe units descending into madness, the killing turning into a frenzy that went beyond duty, brothers beating their condemned comrades until nothing recognizable was left, as if Rome demanded not just death but obliteration, not just discipline, but the destruction of humanity itself. Decimation was rare, but that rarity made it even more terrifying, for it hung like a shadow over the legions, always possible, always waiting, and generals used it like a sword suspended over their men, reminding them that Rome did not forgive failure, that death could come not from the enemy, but from their own brothers. The punishment's cruelty lay not only in the death of the chosen, but in the corruption of the survivors, for the legions carried on, but their loyalty was poisoned, their brotherhood shattered, their bond drowned in the blood of their own. And this was Rome's secret genius, that it ruled not only with laws and weapons, but with fear so profound it reached into the soul, binding men to obedience with chains invisible yet unbreakable. Decimation was a horror that crucifixion could not match, for crucifixion humiliated one man before the crowd, but decimation humiliated an entire unit, destroying trust, staining every soldier with guilt, and proving that Rome's true weapon was not the sword but fear, not the shield but terror, and in that terror the empire built its might. An empire whose strength came not from glory but from brutality, not from honor but from the betrayal of brothers beating each other to death in the dust, their screams swallowed by Rome's silence, their blood feeding the roots of empire. Chapter 5. Scaphism, the death of rot and vermin. There was a punishment so vile, so revolting, that it seemed less like justice and more like a nightmare designed by sadists, and while it was most famously whispered about among Rome's eastern enemies, the empire itself adopted it in its darkest moments. A horror known as scaphism, the death of rot and vermin, a punishment so grotesque that crucifixion looked merciful by comparison, for the condemned was not simply killed, but transformed into living carrion, a body turned into a nest for insects, a feast for vermin, a slow-rotting corpse still breathing, and the terror of it began with the preparation, when the victim was stripped naked and forced between two hollowed-out boats or bound between wooden planks, their head, arms, and legs left exposed while the rest of their body was trapped inside, and then executioners smeared every inch of flesh with honey and milk, forcing the victim to drink until their stomach overflowed, the sweet smell attracting swarms of flies, wasps, and beetles. And it was here, before death even began, that the horror revealed itself, for the condemned could see insects already crawling across their skin, already laying eggs in their open pores, already biting into their flesh while they still screamed. Unlike crucifixion, where death came in days, scaphism dragged on for weeks, the victim left floating on stagnant water or abandoned in swamps where insects bred freely, their exposed body stinking of sweat, waste, and honey, drawing not only flies but rats and worms, creatures burrowing into the flesh while the condemned, still alive, felt their skin crawl, their muscles twitch, their blood drawn sip by thousands of tiny mouths. Each bite a reminder that death was not coming swiftly, but inch by inch. The darkest secret of scaphism was not only that it killed slowly, but that it forced the victim to rot while still breathing, for as the days passed, their body swelled with infection. Maggots hatching inside their wounds, worms crawling beneath the skin, and the honey that once drew insects now mixed with pus and blood, creating a stench so overpowering that even executioners gagged. Yet Rome found pleasure in this horror, leaving the victim where crowds could see, where people could laugh at the sight of a man covered in buzzing flies, his flesh alive with crawling parasites, his screams drowned by the endless drone of wings. The punishment was designed not only to kill, but to strip away every shred of humanity, for the victim was no longer seen as a man, but as meat, as a carcass being devoured while still alive. And the Romans knew that this was the true terror, the complete degradation of body and soul, for there is no death more horrifying than one in which the victim feels themselves being eaten alive, piece by piece, unable to fight, unable to escape, only able to scream until their voice is stolen by exhaustion and their throat swells with infection. Some victims lingered for more than a week, their skin blistered by the sun by day, frozen by the cold at night, their body bloated with decay yet still clinging to life, their mind breaking under the knowledge that they were alive while their body was food. And this madness was as much the punishment as the pain. For scaphism was designed to make the victim lose not only life, but sanity, to transform their final days into a descent into screaming delirium, surrounded by the crawling whispers of thousands of insects feasting on their body. What made scaphism worse than crucifixion was its intimacy with rot, its partnership with nature's most merciless creatures, for crucifixion killed by exhaustion and exposure, but scaphism killed by infestation, by turning the body itself into a coffin filled with crawling life. And the memory of such deaths spread through whispers, soldiers and slaves telling tales of the buzzing swarms, the bubbling wounds, the unbearable smell of men who rotted alive. And these whispers became weapons, terror strong enough to control entire populations without a sword being drawn. The Romans, who prided themselves on order and justice, revealed in scaphism their darkest truth, that punishment was not about balance or fairness, but about fear, that they would invent torments so horrifying that the thought of rebellion curdled in the mind before it could form, that empire was not built on stone, but on blood, not sustained by law, but by the endless buzzing of insects feeding on the flesh of the condemned. In this punishment, death itself became a spectacle of decay, a horror show that blurred the line between life and carrion, and in the end, the victim was not executed so much as consumed, their body eaten by vermin until there was nothing left but bones, their humanity devoured long before their final breath, proving that Rome's genius was not in its architecture or philosophy, but in its ability to craft punishments that could turn men into living corpses, rotting in the sun while the empire watched. Chapter 6. Death by Molten Metal. There was one Roman punishment that was so horrific, so chilling, that even speaking of it made men tremble: the execution by molten metal. Imagine the moment when a man is dragged into the forum, his arms chained so tightly that his skin begins to tear, while the jeering crowd presses closer, eager to watch a death that would not simply end a life, but reduce a body to a screaming, burning husk. The Romans, masters of cruelty, had perfected the art of pain, and molten metal was their weapon of choice against those they wanted not just to silence, but to obliterate. There was no quick strike, no mercy in this punishment, because the metal was not poured upon the body to kill instantly, but forced down the throat, filling the insides of the victim with a burning flood of death. Witnesses wrote of the way the body convulsed as the fiery metal boiled through the stomach and lungs, melting organs from within, while the screams that burst from the victim's mouth turned into gurgles, then into nothing but the hiss of burning flesh. This was not just execution, it was spectacle, designed to terrify every person who stood in the shadow of Rome's power. The Romans believed that fear was the strongest weapon of control, and what better way to remind the masses of the price of disobedience than to let them see a man's body turned into a furnace? The punishment was most often reserved for traitors, counterfeiters, or those who dared to betray trust in the empire's economy, for nothing symbolized greed and corruption better than being destroyed by molten gold or lead. Ancient whispers tell of corrupt officials made to swallow molten gold, a cruel irony that turned their hunger for wealth into the very cause of their deaths. As the liquid metal tore through flesh and bone, spectators claimed that the victim's stomach sometimes split open, and steam hissed from their mouths like smoke from a kiln. There was no possibility of survival, no faint chance of escape, only the slow, unstoppable march of burning death. What made this punishment even darker was the ritual humiliation that surrounded it. The condemned were mocked as the metal was prepared, soldiers taunting them with cups of cold water, asking if they were thirsty before offering them instead the boiling cup of death. The crowd, hungry for horror, laughed and shouted, treating the execution not as a solemn event, but as twisted entertainment. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders to see better. Women leaned forward eagerly, and the stench of burning bodies mixed with the metallic tang of blood and fire, coating the air so thickly that some said they could taste it on their tongues long after the punishment ended. It was a theater of cruelty, and the stage was the human body itself. But the true horror lay in the way the Romans believed this punishment sent a message beyond death. To be killed by molten metal was not just to die in agony. It was to have your body desecrated, to have no chance of being whole in the afterlife. Romans feared mutilation after death, and this punishment guaranteed that a victim's remains were ruined beyond recognition. The molten lead hardened within the corpse, freezing into grotesque lumps that split the body open when cooled. Families who begged for the remains of their loved ones were sometimes handed only a charred shell, unrecognizable, infused with solid metal. A body that was no longer a body, but a grotesque sculpture of suffering. The execution by molten metal also carried with it a hidden cruelty, the way it blurred the line between punishment and ritual. Roman officials sometimes staged these deaths as warnings at festivals, aligning them with religious processions so that the gods themselves were thought to be witnesses to the destruction. This mingling of divine imagery and human agony made the punishment more than physical. It was spiritual terror, meant to suggest that even the gods approved of such cruelty. The priests, robed in white, would stand nearby as the executioner poured the liquid fire, and the victim's final cries echoed against the marble columns, a twisted hymn of death offered to the empire's thirst for order. Some historians whisper that Rome borrowed this method from the Persians or Carthaginians, but in the hands of the empire it became something darker, perfected into a punishment that erased not just life but dignity. No matter its origin, it was remembered as one of the cruelest forms of death, a symbol of Rome's mastery of both law and horror. To die on a cross was slow and degrading, but at least the body remained human. To die by molten metal was to be consumed by fire, to have one's insides turned into ash, and to leave behind nothing but the smell of burning flesh and the laughter of those who watched. In the end, the true secret of this punishment was not just its brutality, but its purpose. It was meant to turn a man's body into a warning, his death into a living example of terror. Every Roman who saw it would never forget it, and that memory was Rome's greatest weapon. The empire did not just kill, it made death into a spectacle so dark, so unforgettable, that obedience seemed the only way to survive. Chapter 7. The Cage of Starvation. Imagine being locked inside a small iron cage so tight that you cannot even stretch your arms, so low that you cannot stand, and so narrow that even sitting feels like your bones are being crushed. The Romans used this punishment not only to break the body, but also to destroy the mind, and the condemned was forced to endure days, sometimes weeks, trapped inside a prison made of iron, exposed to the world, and slowly eaten alive by hunger, thirst, and despair. The punishment was simple yet terrifyingly effective. The victim was placed inside an iron cage, often displayed in public, and left without food or water until their body finally gave up. At first, the crowd would come to laugh, jeer, and mock the prisoner, throwing insults, rotten food, or stones. But soon the laughter died as the prisoner's face grew gaunt, their skin sagged, and their eyes became hollow pits of madness. The cage made escape impossible and movement unbearable. The victim's muscles stiffened, their bones cramped, and every breath turned into a battle as the body weakened. Unlike the quick pain of crucifixion, the cage of starvation was designed to stretch suffering into a slow descent into living death. Day after day, the condemned would watch the sun rise and fall, their mouth too dry to speak, their stomach twisting in unbearable pain, while the crowd watched their humanity rot away. The Romans believed this punishment was worse than death itself, for it stripped a person of dignity, reduced them to a spectacle, and let the public see what starvation truly did to the human body. What made this punishment especially cruel was the way the Romans used the cage as a tool of both execution and humiliation. Sometimes the cages were placed near marketplaces or city gates, where people came and went, forcing the starving body to become part of the scenery, a living warning of what happened to those who disobeyed. The condemned person could hear children laugh, lovers whisper, and merchants shout prices, all while their body withered away. The cruelty was deliberate. They were meant to remain conscious for as long as possible, aware of every humiliation, every whisper, and every laugh directed at their suffering. Death did not come suddenly, it came in stages, first with cramps and dizziness, then with hallucinations, then with the body cannibalizing itself, muscle by muscle, organ by organ. The victim would shake, vomit, cry out in delirium, or bang their head against the bars of the cage, begging for mercy that never arrived. Sometimes people threw water or food at the cage, not to feed them, but to mock their desperation, letting the drops spill to the ground where the condemned could not reach. To the Romans, this was entertainment wrapped in justice, cruelty packaged as law. There were darker secrets about this punishment, ones the Romans did not always record but whispered about. It is said that in some cases, guards or spectators would place scraps of food just beyond reach, hanging them on sticks or dangling them through the bars, watching the prisoners stretch until their arms bruised, their bones cracked, and their skin tore open from the effort. The cage itself was designed to trap not just flesh, but hope, for the closer relief seemed, the more painful it became to realize it was impossible to grasp. And when night fell, the punishment did not end. Rats and stray dogs prowled around the cages, gnawing at fingers, biting at legs, sometimes chewing into flesh while the victim was still alive. Insects swarmed open sores, maggots hatched in wounds, and the body still alive became a banquet for vermin before it was allowed to become a corpse. The cage of starvation turned the human body into an open grave that everyone could witness. The Roman elite loved this method because it required no bloodshed from their hands. It was slow, quiet, and terrifying in its simplicity. It did not stain the streets with gore, yet it left an unforgettable image of human misery. The cage was also used for traitors, deserters, and sometimes even slaves who had dared to strike back at their masters. It was a punishment that did not need a sword, a whip, or a cross, only time and cruelty. Some historians claim that in certain cases, victims were left alive in the cage until they were nothing but skin stretched over bone, their eyes bulging out of hollow sockets, and even then, the Romans refused to grant mercy. Death became a blessing denied until the very end, and the crowd was forced to look at what starvation did when stretched to its most extreme. The most chilling part of this punishment was the silence. Unlike executions filled with screams and blood, the cage of starvation was quiet. The condemned grew too weak to shout, too dry to cry, too broken to even move, until finally they were reduced to a whisper, a groan, and finally nothing at all. Days later, when the body was finally lifeless, it would still be left hanging inside the cage, a shriveled husk for all to see, a reminder of Roman power and cruelty. Even after death, the cage was a prison, for corpses were left to rot, bones rattling inside iron, flesh turning to dust, while passers-by avoided the stench. In this way, the punishment continued even after life had ended, leaving behind a grotesque monument to Rome's brutal sense of justice. The cage of starvation was not just about killing. It was about stripping away humanity piece by piece until the victim was no longer seen as a person, but as a warning sign. It forced people to see death not as a single blow, but as a slow unraveling, a horror show that lasted days, sometimes weeks under the burning Roman sun. It was not a punishment meant to reform, but to destroy completely, body and soul, while feeding the darkest desires of a society that loved to watch others suffer. And perhaps the darkest secret of all was this. For the Romans, the cage was not just about justice, it was about control, a way to remind the living that Rome could decide not only how you lived, but exactly how you would die, starved, humiliated, and forgotten in an iron prison. Chapter 8. The Breaking Wheel. Bones torn, flesh is sliced. Picture the moment when a man is tied to a giant wooden wheel, his limbs stretched and bound with ropes, his body exposed to the cold winds and jeering crowds, knowing that every bone in his body is about to be shattered one by one. The Romans called this the breaking wheel, a punishment designed not just to kill, but to obliterate the human body in the most deliberate, torturous way possible. Unlike crucifixion, where the body hangs in agony but death is drawn out mostly by exhaustion and exposure, the breaking wheel was a methodical destruction, an orchestration of pain that turned the human skeleton into splinters and the flesh into torn ribbons, and the crowd was an essential part of this horror, watching every strike, every snap, every scream as if it were a performance. Executioners used heavy clubs or iron cudgels, striking the victim's arms, legs, and ribs with precision, making the bones crack in audible bursts while the victim writhed in agony, often pleading for mercy that would never come. Some historians describe how the victim was rolled on the wheel afterward, making the broken limbs grind against the wooden frame, causing muscles to tear further and blood to spill in thick, dark rivers onto the cobblestones, while the sun glinted off the blood-soaked wood, turning the scene into a grotesque spectacle that terrorized all who watched. The cruelty of the breaking wheel went beyond mere physical torment. Victims were often conscious for hours, forced to feel every impact, every snap, every grinding movement. And the longer they remained alive, the more the horror spread. Some executioners crushed fingers and toes first, then moved to larger bones, prolonging suffering in a deliberate order designed to maximize terror. The darkest secret of this punishment, however, was the psychological torment. The victim knew the sequence of their own destruction, understanding that death would come only after their body had been shredded, leaving behind only a hollow shell. The Romans sometimes left the broken body on the wheel for days, exposed to the sun, wind, and animals, so that even after death the corpse became a warning, a shrine of fear to remind citizens that defiance was met with methodical annihilation. Families of the condemned were forced to witness this, amplifying the terror and ensuring that obedience ran deeper than the threat of personal pain. It became a societal law enforced by horror. The punishment was particularly favored for murderers, rebels, and traitors, those whose crime Rome considered a threat to social order. By breaking the body, the Romans made a statement that betrayal or violence against the empire was not simply punishable by death, but by the destruction of every physical part of oneself. Executioners were trained in the technique, striking with such force and rhythm that the victim's suffering was maximized without killing immediately, and sometimes multiple executioners worked in shifts to keep the torture continuous. Children, slaves, and soldiers alike watched in terror as bones splintered like dry wood, ribs collapsing under precision strikes, arms and legs mangled beyond recognition, and the victims' cries echoed in the streets, mixing with the crowd's shouts, turning the execution into a symphony of suffering orchestrated by Rome itself. One of the darkest secrets of the breaking wheel was the way it played with hope. Victims were sometimes given brief moments of partial relief, limbs momentarily repositioned or bound differently, only to be struck again, prolonging agony and instilling despair. Those who attempted to resist, to scream louder, or to wriggle free, were punished with even greater force, ensuring that the human spirit itself was crushed along with the skeleton. In some accounts, the executioners would place the broken body back onto the wheel and rotate it, allowing sharp edges of wood to dig deeper, tearing torn flesh further, and exposing internal organs in the open air, a grotesque display designed to be unforgettable. Unlike crucifixion, which could leave the victim somewhat recognizable, the breaking wheel obliterated identity as thoroughly as it obliterated the body, leaving only a fragmented mass of splintered bones, shredded muscles, and blood-soaked clothes as a testament to the empire's power. The Romans also understood that fear was more contagious than punishment itself. Public executions with the wheel ensured that entire cities learned the price of defiance without taking up arms. Rumors of the wheel's use spread far beyond Rome, and tales of men broken limb by limb circulated in whispers that made even the bravest hesitate before committing crimes. The punishment was as much about creating a psychological weapon as it was about physical destruction, teaching obedience through terror and instilling the memory of agony in the minds of witnesses for generations. Sometimes after the execution, scavengers and birds would feed on the remains while the wheel stood in the open, a grim monument of punishment and decay, reminding the living that the empire's wrath was thorough and unrelenting. The breaking wheel stands as one of Rome's darkest inventions, a testament to an empire that could turn death into a calculated instrument of horror, crafting suffering that outlasted the victim, poisoned the mind, and spread fear like wildfire. It was more than law, it was performance, instruction, and warning, rolled into one nightmare of splintered wood, shattered bones, and agonized flesh. In that horror, Rome revealed a truth as dark as its empire itself, that ultimate power is not in conquest or architecture, but in mastering fear, turning human bodies into instruments of terror, and ensuring that no one would forget what happened to those who dared defy its reach. Chapter 9. The Brazen Bull, Roasting Alive in Bronze. Imagine being locked inside a hollow bronze bull, its metal body heated until it glows like molten gold, while your screams echo through the chamber, amplified and twisted into the terrifying sounds of a raging beast. This was the Roman punishment known as the Brazen Bull, a torture so cruel that crucifixion seems merciful in comparison, for it did not merely end life. It turned the condemned into a living instrument of horror, The victim was forced into the bull's metallic body, doors closed, limbs bound so tightly that struggling only caused more pain. And once inside, fire was lit beneath the bronze, raising the temperature until the flesh and muscles began to cook alive. Ingenious in its cruelty, the Romans designed a system of pipes that turned the victim's screams into guttural, terrifying roars, so that the sound that escaped the bull resembled the bellowing of a raging animal. The crowd outside heard not the cries of a human being, but the monstrous roars of a creature, making the punishment both spectacle and psychological terror. A warning that no rebellion, theft, or betrayal would go unpunished, and that Rome's inventiveness in cruelty knew no bounds. The horror of the brazen bull went far beyond physical pain. The victim's death was prolonged as the heat gradually penetrated the bronze, searing skin, boiling blood, and roasting organs from the inside out. Those who survived the initial burns writhed in agony, trapped in a tight metallic shell, their bodies slowly stiffening while the scent of burning flesh filled the air. Romans believed that punishment must terrorize both the body and the mind, and the brazen bull achieved this perfectly. Witnesses described the flames licking at the bronze, the metal groaning as it expanded, and the amplified cries that made the crowd shudder, blending fascination with fear. The design ensured maximum suffering. Limbs could not move freely. Twisting caused further injury, and the victim's mouth, jaw, and throat burned while the screams were carried through the pipes, distorting their human anguish into something monstrous. What made this punishment darker than crucifixion was its sadistic creativity. Crucifixion punished through exposure and exhaustion, but the brazen bull tortured with invention, combining fire, metal, and sound to create an unforgettable nightmare. The executioners often added layers of cruelty, forcing victims to enter the bull in public, sometimes mocking them before sealing the doors, or threatening family members who watched helplessly. The Romans used this punishment not only for criminals, but for traitors, conspirators, and anyone who dared challenge the empire's authority, ensuring that every story of death carried a lesson of horror, a demonstration of how absolute power could manipulate pain into art. The darkest secrets of the brazen bull reveal that it was more than just a device. It was a symbol of Roman ingenuity and terror. Stories tell of priests and engineers working together to perfect the system, experimenting with different metals and shapes to amplify screams, to trap heat more efficiently, and to prolong suffering as long as possible. Sometimes victims were fed a small amount of water or food, only to prolong life so that the agony could be extended, their organs cooking slowly, their lungs filled with smoke, their cries made into an instrument of warning. The cruelty was psychological as much as physical, the knowledge that your own voice would be distorted into the roar of a beast, that the world would hear your terror as entertainment, left survivors, or rather those who could live long enough, hollow and broken even before death claimed them. The brazen bull also symbolized the ultimate humiliation. While crucifixion left the victim exposed, the brazen bull hid the human form entirely, turning a person into an object of fear, a machine of suffering, and a tool of spectacle. The empire took pride in its ability to transform natural death into an engineered horror, combining technology and sadism into a punishment that left no trace of mercy. Those who witnessed it remembered not the crime of the condemned, but the ingenuity of the punishment, the brilliance of a state that could twist both body and mind into submission through fear. Flames, metal, and pipes worked together to create a soundscape of agony, a terror that lingered long after the fire had burned out, leaving both crowd and executioners with memories that haunted sleep and waking alike. Another hidden aspect of this punishment was the way it targeted identity. Victims often came from the upper classes, conspirators, or those whose betrayal carried symbolic weight. By hiding their bodies inside the bull and distorting their cries, Rome erased individuality while amplifying the horror. Death became not personal but theatrical, a narrative of fear that every citizen absorbed. Even after death, the burned body inside the bull could remain as a warning, a twisted monument to innovation and cruelty, reminding future generations that Rome valued power and fear over life, dignity, or justice. In the end, the brazen bull was more than a device. It was an instrument of terror designed to haunt memory and imagination alike. Flames consumed the body, pipes amplified the agony, and the crowd witnessed not just punishment, but spectacle, a horror that reached into every mind and left an indelible mark. Rome perfected a form of execution that merged creativity with cruelty, combining sound, fire, and metal into a punishment that was as psychological as it was physical, as dark as it was unforgettable. In its screaming, burning, distorted victims, the empire displayed its mastery over both life and fear, proving that no crime could escape retribution and no imagination could exceed the depths of its cruelty. Chapter 10. Crucifixion of the Damned. Picture the condemned stretched across a crude wooden cross, arms pulled wide, feet pinned, body trembling with pain, sweat mixing with blood, skin blistering under the unrelenting sun, and every breath a battle as muscles tear and ligaments strain. Crucifixion, the ultimate emblem of Roman brutality, was not merely a method of execution, but a slow, public theater of suffering designed to strip the victim of dignity, identity, and life itself. Though many may think of crucifixion as the standard horror, its darkest form, reserved for slaves, rebels, and those who defied the empire, was an orchestration of agony so complete that it went beyond the body, searing the mind and soul. The process began with flogging, often hours or days before the actual crucifixion, using whips embedded with metal and bone, tearing flesh and leaving the victim raw and vulnerable, muscles exposed, nerves laid bare. Then came the nails, thick, cruel iron spikes hammered into the palms, sometimes the wrists, while the victim gasped for air, the chest muscles burning with every inhalation, arms screaming under the weight of a body they were never meant to support. The Romans understood anatomy well enough to ensure that every movement of breathing became torture, that hanging on the cross was agony multiplied with every heartbeat. But crucifixion was not only about nails and pain. The Romans designed it as exposure, a punishment that attacked the senses as much as the body. Victims were left on the cross for days, their flesh roasted by sun, chilled by night, wet with rain, crawling with insects, and often pecked by birds seeking the flesh of the weak. Their screams echoed through marketplaces and city streets, a grim melody of fear meant to terrorize both the living and the would-be disobedient. Hunger and thirst gnawed relentlessly, and the slow loss of fluids caused dizziness, hallucinations, and delirium, leaving victims aware of every wound, every insect bite, every mocking shout from the crowd. This was psychological as well as physical torture, ensuring that death was not a release, but a drawn-out ordeal where the mind suffered as much as the body. The darkest secret of crucifixion was in its prolonged nature. Rome deliberately made it slow, letting life ebb away in a way that maximized terror, turning a human being into a living corpse long before the end came. The spectacle was amplified by the setting. Crosses were often placed along busy roads near city gates or on hilltops, visible for miles. Passers-by, traders and soldiers, could not avoid seeing the bodies, watching flesh twist and tear, listening to gasps and screams that carried across the fields. The Romans believed that punishment should serve as a lesson to all, and in crucifixion, they perfected fear as a tool of social control. Children witnessed agony, families trembled, and the city absorbed the lesson of obedience enforced by pain. Those crucified were dehumanized, reduced to objects of terror, their humanity stripped piece by piece, so that their death carried not only the weight of justice, but the full force of horror. Crucifixion also held hidden horrors that history barely mentions. Victims often lingered conscious for days, their internal organs failing, their blood pressure dropping, their skin rotting in the sun, while flies and maggots feasted on their wounds. Some survivors were taken down too late, already brain damaged from lack of oxygen, left alive but broken. There are accounts of Romans deliberately prolonging this stage, turning death into a drawn-out experiment in pain. Occasionally, salt or vinegar-soaked cloth was rubbed into wounds, ensuring infection and intensifying suffering. The victim's struggle for air was excruciating, chest muscles tearing as they pushed upward, only to collapse downward repeatedly, a rhythm of torment that could last hours, turning breathing itself into a tool of punishment. The psychological terror of crucifixion was amplified by its public nature. The condemned often witnessed the reactions of others, jeering crowds, sobbing family members, and sometimes even fellow criminals hanging nearby. Shame and humiliation were as important as pain, for the Romans believed that the fear of public degradation could prevent rebellion, keeping the empire's subjects obedient through terror. The combination of physical torment, exposure, hunger, thirst, insect infestation, and mental anguish made crucifixion one of the most horrifying punishments ever devised, a method that left nothing untouched and no part of the victim's existence spared from agony. Even after death, crucifixion carried cruelty. Bodies were often left on the cross to rot, serving as gruesome reminders of the empire's reach and wrath. Ravens, crows, and dogs would feed on the corpses, the stench of decay mixing with the iron scent of blood. Sometimes families were denied burial, leaving their loved ones as monuments of terror visible to all. In this way, Rome extended punishment beyond life, ensuring that fear endured, that lessons of obedience were carried in memory, and that horror became a tool of governance. Crucifixion was a totalizing punishment, attacking flesh, mind, spirit, and society simultaneously. It was meticulous, public, and horrifying in every aspect, a testament to the empire's mastery of terror and cruelty. In the end, crucifixion embodied the darkest truths of Roman punishment, a society capable of transforming death into spectacle, of prolonging suffering with precision, and of controlling populations through horror. Nails, exposure, hunger, thirst, insects, and shame worked together to make life unbearable, and death a lingering, merciless process. It is no wonder that crucifixion has haunted human imagination for millennia, a symbol not just of execution, but of calculated, intimate cruelty, a method perfected by the Romans to remind everyone that in the empire, the law ruled through fear, pain, and the ultimate dominion over life itself. If you think your day is bad, wait until you see what the Romans did for fun. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we dive into the darkest, most twisted secrets of history. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single nightmare we uncover.